takes quite a long time for the computer to do compared to just evaluating an object, which is what all it has to do with JSON. XML, however, can be useful if you've got something where the document structure is important. For instance, if you had a word processor document, then it's quite important to know that something is a heading, that something is a paragraph, things like that. So, and JSON abstracts a lot of that away. So if the structure and the semantics of the document are more important than the data, or as important as the data, I should say, then XML is still a good format to use. And also XML allows you to do things like XML transformations, where you can transform from one format of XML into another, which means you can, for instance, take some data and transform it into a graph using scalable vector graphics or something like that. But as a general, unless one of those special cases apply where you need a document structure or you want to do a style sheet transformation, JSON should be your format of choice because it's fast and it's lightweight. So just a quick introduction to JSON so that when we start using it, you know what you're looking at. It uses two ways of denoting data objects. You can have variables and arrays, you can have objects and arrays. If you've done programming in other languages, you may be aware of something called an associative array. The difference being that with an array, each element is referred to as a number, a sequential number. In an object or associative array, everything is referred to by a name. And you saw, back up a sec, here, each element of this object is referred to as a title, artist, label, whereas these objects within the array will be referred to as 1, 2, and so on. When you're writing it, you list out your objects or your arrays or your array elements, and each one will be comma separated. That's important to know. You don't just have, say, open square bracket, a word, and then a new line, and then another word. They will both be part of the same element. They wouldn't be two separate ones just because they're on a different line. Much like having a CSV file, you comma delimit every element of your data, basically. As I said, it's the same syntax used within JavaScript, so you can use it as shorthand. You don't have to define an object so verbosely in JavaScript. If you're using this, you can just put two square brackets and you've got an empty object, or two square brackets, you've got an empty array, two curly braces, and you've got an empty object, as you'll see when you come to do the lab. There's also another format to be aware of called JSON-P. Now, I was talking earlier about how you can't do cross-domain requests with AJAX, and how you'd have to use a proxy script. JSON-P is shorthand for JSON with padding, which is a silly name, but it's what it's called. And here's an example of what it. Here's an example of what it looks like. Basically, when we're using JSON-P, rather than having a pure JSON string returned to us, what we have is a call to a function with JSON as the argument. And what then happens is we have that function defined within our program, and the data gets passed into it. And you'll see, if you do the advanced exercise in the lab, how this can help us. It's not too important to worry about if you don't understand it. Just looking at it like this, I didn't really understand it until yesterday, so don't worry too much. But the important thing to know is that this lets us get data from a web service on another server. Right, so now we'll look at our options. Now we've got some data from somewhere and we know how we're going to parse it. We need to look at processing it so that we can use it and present it to the user. So some of the ways we can do this: built-in JavaScript functionality. For instance, if you were using a calculator, JavaScript has a math object, and any sort of function that you want to do with a sort of standard scientific calculator, you'd be able to do with the functionality that's built into JavaScript's API. Frameworks, as I discussed earlier, will give you sort of a library of functions and methods that you can work with. different sorts of objects like the math object, which let you have a predefined sort of group of functions that do the same sort of jobs. And again, web services, you might find that there's a web service which you can send the data you've collected to, and then it will process it for you and then give you back in the format which you want to display. So some of the functionality that's built into JavaScript is good for us. String processing, so you can search strings, you can cut them down, you can use regular expressions which you may have come across before. They're a really powerful way of looking through strings of data.